Thank you very much. So we are waiting, I think, from our first guest, Eapen Thampy of American for Forfeiture Reform. Before we, and he's not in the queue, I don't think yet. We're waiting on that, and Jamie, of course, lined that up. So if there's a delay and someone's not happy, so I don't want to spend too much time. We have a very important guest coming at 9 o'clock is the scheduled time for the sheriff. Am I right about that?
Yes.
Okay. I did want to return because I would have ranted about it maybe, but one of the things that is just distressing and the lack of real understanding of the implementation of the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act has been this overburdensome placement of the doctor's involvement with the patients and to what extent they are required to be involved and how much knowledge are they supposed to have about marijuana, and it just has become really ridiculous. And the most important point I think that can be made is that under no circumstances in any other field of medicine are doctors held to that type of standard, and a standard by which is they're being held to where there's virtually no medical science that's accepted by the traditional medical community. It's one of the biggest catch-22s that doctors are being placed into. But beyond my compassion and sympathy for the doctors that are courageous enough to participate in the program is the absolute and utter violation of what would seem to be basic constitutional rights of a person being able to talk about why they were doing what their mindset was in terms of why they were doing what they're doing, and potentially being deprived of that as almost having to recreate facts. It's not the way it's supposed to be. I mean, I read a little bit in the Chesterfield situation, but that guy got a right to a trial. In this other case, which involves some of the sickest people, as I said, more than at least 2 have passed since the hearing, and every patient that's mentioned, is been diagnosed with terminal cancer. All right, so the producers tapped me in the back and indicated there that we have our first guest, Eapen Thampy. Eapen, thanks for calling in. Welcome back to Planet Green Trees.
Hi, Eapen Thampy. Are you there?
Wrong. All right.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry about that. Eapen. All right. Eapen, of course, is president, founder of the American for Forfeiture Reform, and the director. Anyways, and we've been communicating, and we were just talking about a news story or blog that I wrote. What is your tell the listeners what is the most common reaction you get when you begin to explain to people in the community about the forfeiture laws nationally and in each of the states?
Well, a lot of people is this America? Unfortunately, it is. One of the issues really see forfeiture is that this is not something new in our history. This has been around with us for a while, or at least this is something that we as a nation have experienced before. The King of England used to use asset forfeiture as a mechanism of colonial law enforcement, and the citizens of Boston were famous for having risen up in anger at the way that the King's law enforcement went after their businessmen and their citizens with this predatory law enforcement tactic, among other things, including, of course, gun confiscation. But we got rid of that with when we founded this nation and signed the Declaration of Independence and enshrined the Constitution. And Congress has chosen to bring asset forfeiture back as a tool of the war on drugs. And now I think society is at this point where all these things have been understood and exposed, and we understand now, I think, that some of our most fundamental traditions and rights have been stripped away by the drug war. And again, people ask, "Is this America?" Where this is all this is happening. I guess that's my most common reaction.
That's something that we talked about. People are just totally blown away, like when they get dragged into the criminal justice system for some technical violation, as we get calls to my office all the time about. Before we even get to the criminal case, which is often under investigation for 3 to 6 months before we find out about criminal charges, they have to make all these decisions about what to do, where to go, and where to post their bond, and their property is taken. They have no idea what to do, where to go. I think many, if not half, of the forfeiture cases result in defaults because people don't understand what they're supposed to do and don't post the money at the right time or within the time frame, and by default will lose their property. But as we move forward in forfeiture, reform of cannabis laws, or at least giving the appearance in some jurisdictions, how does what is the discussion amongst the forfeiture community, if any? The for it or against it, of how those proceeds are going to be able to be accounted for if they're not being accounted for from the traditional methods such as marijuana-related confiscations.
Well, this goes back to the heart of why we have the United States. In our country, the executive branch is supposed to be checked by the legislative and judicial branches, and the power to act is contingent on the power to spend. So under civil asset forfeiture, we have a new system where instead of going to a legislature or to a governing body for their money, law enforcement goes to the streets and seizes property in cash. So we have civil forfeiture has done something very fundamental to law enforcement. It's disconnected them from oversight and from accountability, and it's done that by giving them their own revenue stream. So where does that money come from? If people like me are successful in taking it away as a revenue stream for law enforcement? Well, my thought is very simple. The law enforcement in this country at the state, local, and federal level should have to go to a legislature, and that legislature has to, as these bodies are supposed to do, express the will of the people through their representation and, appropriate money from the general revenue. That's how law enforcement should be funded. They shouldn't be, law enforcement should not be reliant on funding that they generate. And in that world, you have the executive branch is self-dealing to itself. It's assuming the power of the purse. It is assuming that, because you have this power, you have the consent of the governed, and that's not true.
Right, and just so people know, explain how how the law enforcement community, what aspects of the law enforcement community are profiting and how they profit from forfeiture proceeds. How does that work?
Well, I thought the blog post that Michael published was awesome. And it had a great explanation, especially how the federal government has stuck its nose in this process. But the basic idea is that under asset forfeiture, the government, the police, the law enforcement agency can seize property. They can seize this property without evidence or arresting anyone or probable cause. All they have to do is say that there's some kind of nexus between the property and a suspected crime. That's all that you need to have your property taken by the government. And then the other half of it, how they make money, is they auction it. They sell it, or if it's cash, they deposit it in their bank account, and they take a claim to that property. And they do this, and the other thing about civil forfeiture is that it exists under a unique legal fiction, where the property in the eyes of the law is literally a person, and which is a clever maneuver, by the government to take your rights to your constitutionally guaranteed rights to property away from you. By saying your property is now a person, they're able to, pretend that this relationship between you and the property doesn't have, its own you know that you don't own this piece of property. So you know, it's a scam. It's a revenue scam. Ultimately, it incentivizes law enforcement to not only enforce laws that people don't necessarily want them enforcing, but also to lobby for further laws. You know, under forfeiture, law enforcement has a financially vested interest in the laws that they're enforcing. They become a special interest. You know, that's a dangerous and corrosive thing to any democratic society.
It is kind of tragic. One of the other things that that is often not mentioned is that the incentive is that the budgets for many of these agencies is determined. I'm speaking about, at least in Michigan, it is the multi-jurisdictional task force or the drug task force who get their budget from asset forfeiture. It's matched dollar for dollar by the actual federal government, incentivizing them to fight for forfeiture. I mean, it's really strange when, just from a lawyer's perspective, when a forfeiture action takes place, client has to go post a bond. You know, we don't even have a copy of the affidavit for the search warrant yet. You know, police are, demanding or trying to threaten and scare the person to resolve the case potentially or do a buyback where they give cash, resolve the matter, buy back the property that they own. And, if they don't, then they've got to post a certain amount of bond and the case lingers and holds up. But if the criminal case isn't brought, they will proceed with the civil case. They will file a lawsuit. They will, send interrogatories and requests to admit, and, which brings up issues of your right to remain silent, your right to, so it gets very, very, it's so against the grain of the way in which the system is supposed to work with a presumption of innocence. But, I know Michigan and Rick and Jamie, maybe you can chime in on this. We know that Representative Irwin had introduced a bill with, amongst other, McMillan from Lapeer? Rochester. And I don't know if it's gotten anywhere, but and I'd asked Eapen in our last conversation, nothing at the federal level. I know there's always talk of this, but there's been no traction really of any bills being presented in such a way that would have an impact anywhere.
That's not entirely, there's not much happening at the federal level. In a sense, that's not entirely true. What is always happening at the federal level is that there's always another agency or another Department of Justice, push for expanded forfeiture powers. For instance, last September, Attorney General Eric Holder expanded the authority of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives to also include administrative forfeiture authority under the Controlled Substances Act. Why are they doing this? Because the BATFE sees all the money that the Drug Enforcement Agency is pulling in through equitable sharing asset forfeiture partnerships with local law enforcement. These highway stops where they pick up someone with thousands of dollars worth of money, the ATF wants that money now. So the real push on the federal level is for more revenue to the federal government, more laws that they can use to enforce an asset forfeiture. There's some pushback. I know we communicate with Congress and see if there's a desire for reform. The Institute for Justice has been active on that front too. I know the Drug Policy Alliance this is also an issue for them. But yeah.
What other organizations get behind forfeiture reform, if any? I mean, obviously the legalization or cannabis reform movement, but not they don't it's not usually sung along with the talking points for cannabis reform. But where else does the support come from? Like, what other groups or if any are affected that are you hear from or that whose voice is being heard in this arena?
Well, as it turns out, ultimately, a lot of specific interest groups are negatively affected by asset forfeiture. During the 2000, the 1997-2000 era, there was a coalition that came together and made asset forfeiture reform a priority. That coalition included the Drug Policy Alliance, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, the Heritage Foundation, Cato. It included the NAACP, the National Realtors Association, the National Yacht Owners Association, all kinds of associations representing specific people who had specific property rights interests, and that's really and part of that story is that asset forfeiture has become such a lucrative revenue stream for federal law enforcement that. And the laws were so bad. In fact, before the Civil Asset Forfeiture Reform Act was signed into law in 2000, there was not actually an innocent owner defense in federal law. So the fact that you were an innocent and could demonstrate that you were not were an innocent person and had committed no crime whatsoever was not a defense under the federal law before 2000 to the government actually taking your property.
You only have recently, right? And as it goes, you have to prove that the property has been acquired by lawful means. The burden shifts to the property owner. And
and that's another violation of fundamental rights. You know, we're guaranteed the presumption of innocence in a criminal case, but because civil forfeiture is essentially an administrative or civil proceeding, you're not entitled to the constitutional rights that you would see in a criminal case.
What are the...
So, the presumption shifts, and you have to prove that your property is innocent.
Right. What are the numbers that they speak of in terms of overall, money brought into the federal government yearly? And are they able to delineate
the federal government is now... If you look at the annual Department of Justice press releases, at the end of the year they'll say, or at the beginning of the year they'll put out a press release. And lately those press releases have been saying, we're pulling in, I think the last, in 2013 or so, I think they pulled in over $5 billion through various asset forfeitures. Now, keep in mind, part of that was due to, specific big-ticket forfeitures. For instance, there's a lot of asset forfeiture that they use, proceedings that they use to settle claims against the Madoff estate. And, there was also a $500 million forfeiture penalty that Google paid for showing Canadian pharmaceutical ads to American consumers. But the Department of Justice has definitely seen the revenue potential here. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York pulls in over $1 billion a year. He's the guy who sits in his U.S. Attorney's office, looks at big companies that have lots of liquid assets and says, what federal law can I say they've broken to institute a forfeiture action against them? That's literally what he sits around doing. Now, bear in mind, it's not always the case. I mean, it's usually the case when you're going after big companies in Wall Street. They're doing something wrong. But to have this kind of revenue-driven enforcement certainly corrupts the entire notion of a impartial prosecutor or impartial process.
Yes, isn't that true? Let me ask you this. Michigan is one of the states that allows for local initiative or ballot initiatives, the state level and the local level. What is the response by the pro-forfeiture groups in regards to this decriminalization effort that is appearing in nationally and also in the state of Michigan as it has been? If do you know?
I think that. I actually have lived in a town in Missouri that has decriminalized marijuana, in Columbia. That law went into effect over 10 years ago. I know that there's, similar situations up in Michigan. I think that if you were able to, so there is legislation you could pass through a city council or local ballot initiative at the ordinance level I think would be effective. And that legislation would say your local law enforcement can't participate in federal asset forfeiture activity. You can't receive proceeds of that activity. If they do receive proceeds of that activity, it has to be sent to the general fund. So that kind of legislation, I think, would be a good complement at the local level to a decriminalization initiative. You mentioned the pro-forfeiture folks. I mean, you mean the cops. You mean the Narcotics Officers Association. The people whose salaries and union fees and benefits and equipment are all paid for by seizure money. They typically don't like what I'm doing, but, I'm willing to have that debate in a public setting, so,
Do you think those same people have an issue with the removing penalties for adults with small amounts of cannabis? Is that low-hanging fruit?
Oh,
they don't like?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Removing marijuana as a criminal offense or even mitigating it gives them less, one fewer place where they can seize property, and one smaller group of one smaller group or one less minority to oppress, so to speak.
For the record, I just want to, I've got in front of me the 2013 forfeiture report out of Michigan, just for those that are interested. And it combines the following agencies: local police agencies, multi-jurisdictional task force, Michigan State Police, and Sheriff's Department. The numbers read as follows. For the year 2013, the net proceeds of forfeiture funds was $22,368,143. It's based on a federally shared funds of $10 million, state and locally shared funds $2,290,000, administrative costs shared paid out $4 million, and gross forfeiture by Michigan statutes $13,777,000. I mean, it's just astronomical. What other branch of government brings in that kind of net proceeds? Is there one other than the Michigan medical marijuana program? That seems strange. Those two things would be like that. But there's huge numbers. Huge numbers. I remember reading when they did the federal shutdown. When the government shut down, they discussed how the budget of the DOJ was going to be cut, from $2 billion to $1.2 billion, from $2 billion to $1.2 billion. And the first thing that struck me is why do they need so much money to? What's their budget? So, and or their DEA, why is their budget like that? What are they doing? Because clearly the war on drugs is not. But and so it goes. So, any final thoughts in terms of where this is going to be going? Do you think the movement towards reform in the treatment of cannabis, nationally at least, is having an impact on the way people are thinking about it, or do you think it just remains this ugly, unknown monster that lives in the closet that nobody sees?
Well, the thing about, I think I recall Ethan Nadelman actually saying that, it's not marijuana that's a gateway drug. It's that marijuana reform is a gateway to drug policy reform, to larger drug policy reform. I think I'm paraphrasing him very badly, but I think you get the idea. The thing about marijuana legalization is that we're building industries that have really seen the worst, have suffered the worst of what the laws are, and now we are talking about a national movement that now has industry and communities supporting it, that are part of it. And we are seeing in so many states right now that industry and that financial support really beginning to express itself politically. And that's the important thing. That's what's happening right now all around the nation. I have never really I don't think there's ever been a better time to be pushing the asset forfeiture message. Why? Because now there's an industry and a community behind it that has seen 40 years of oppression, and they're not happy about it. They're educated. They're getting more powerful, more politically dynamic. So marijuana legalization, I think, will ultimately, provide the architecture for greater things in drug policy. I think we'll see, the industry support serious forfeiture reform at some level, in the future, especially as the resources fall into place to really be active federally.
I would have to agree with that. All right, so you're looking positive or not? Doesn't sound like it. I do think that it's very difficult to reform with of any kind of laws when there's still these incentives. Although I would describe that, I think, to a certain extent, some of the law enforcement community, many in the law enforcement community, I would say local police, sheriffs in many situations, and state police even in some instances, maybe less of that. But it really remains the narcotics enforcement teams, I think, are having the most difficult time, looking past marijuana as an opportunity to, to find crimes. In other words, Michigan, we've got immunity from prosecution, but if you're outside of the statutory limitations of that, but there's ambiguous areas that, and I think some of the officers have become specialized to a certain degree in, finding these loopholes. So at that point, you're no longer immune. It's just a crime, and they can start the asset forfeiture. But I get only the worst calls as a lawyer. I do know that there are people that have positive, interactions with law enforcement and are not interested in messing with patients who have. But at the same time, I hear the worst of it, and it turns into a disaster and an overreach a lot of times. And in some of these, groups, they take what they can because they can, and operate under the theory that possession is 9/10 of the law, sometimes 10/10 of the law, and you're going to have to come rip it from my dead, bloody hand or something like that, But anyways, listen, I want to thank you for coming on the show. You have the final word, if you like. Give people some optimism moving forward on this very, very important topic.
I first became educated about asset forfeiture when I was in high school, actually. So I've seen forfeiture as an issue develop through the 1990s. We saw the largely useless federal reform in 2000. We saw largely useless state reforms in the 2000-2004 period. But now I think that there's a real possibility, there's real hope for meaningful change. First off, we've seen what has failed. We know what to do to be successful. Second, we have political movements and industry supporting us that are very serious about reform. That will go someplace. And third, as marijuana legalization sweeps the nation, I think we'll hit, we already have hit, I think a tipping point. I think in this year, Oregon and Alaska will legalize marijuana. In 2006, I think it's a fair, it's an open game. I think you could see, between 6 and maybe 10 states do something by ballot initiative. It'll be really a race, to see who can get there, and it's things are coming together. I'm extremely optimistic. There's a lot of work ahead of us, but I think the winds are in our favor.
Well, there you have it. We'll leave it on that note. Eapen Thampy from Americans for Forfeiture Reform, thank you for calling in. I tell people all the time that you are a fan of the show, and I'm going to continue to perpetuate that. That's okay with you. Just kidding.
Excellent.
Have a great night, and I enjoyed talking to you always, and look forward to having you back on.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
All righty. I think a good time to probably take a little break here. I'm excited. We're waiting on, of course, the Saginaw County Sheriff, William L. Federspiel. Interested to hear what his thoughts are on some of the topics we like to talk about on the show every week. But we're going to take a break, come back. The call numbers 1-347-326-9626. You're listening to Planet Green Trees. We'll be right back.